Okay, so this is a video where I'm going to be respectfully disagreeing with Johnny Harris. I know these videos are kind of common these days, but look, if you follow my channel, you'll know that I love concepts from social science, economics, or wherever that explain what's going on at a deeper level. The ideas that explain the news. And this video is about one of those concepts I love to examine and pull apart, and I think he gets it wrong. Now, I love Johnny Harris's videos, learned a lot from them, but this is what we're meant to do, right? Debate, improve ideas, discourse. So, okay, let's start.
Our world is built on an idea. It's an idea so powerful that we fight and die for it. We draw our maps around it. It shapes our politics and forms the basis of our very identity, who we think we are. It's an idea so pervasive that you've probably never even stopped to notice how weird it is. Because here's the thing, this idea is completely made up. And even though it might feel like it's been around forever, it's actually newer than you think. That idea is called the nation. It says that a country is more than just the land drawn into a set of borders. It's actually a giant community that is united by heritage and identity. It says that the people, the land, the state, they're all one thing. That thing is called a nation. You're not just a person who happens to live in a place called America. You're American, or Brazilian, or Japanese, or Mexican, or Egyptian, Nigerian, Dutch, Micronesian. But let's stop a moment to learn the story of where this idea came from and how it took over everything. Because once you do, so much about our world suddenly makes sense.
Okay, so that's the intro, and already we've got the key idea, the nation, nationalism. The idea that each state has a nation, and each of us is, as he puts it, part of a giant community that is united by heritage and identity. And that gives us our national identity, American, Brazilian, Japanese, whatever. Harris is saying this is a new thing and, quote, completely made up. To make this argument, he's joined by a guest, and they explore how this idea is based on a series of myths.
We think that borders like France's formed because they contained people with the same ethnicity who spoke the same language, right? But when you overlay a map of the actual genetic makeup in Europe, it looks like this. Now look at France, and you'll see that any given part of the country has closer genetic links with foreigners across the border than they do with their own countrymen.
And I think they're right. There isn't really any genetic basis for individual nationalities. This is a pseudo-scientific idea. It was popular in the 1800s, associated with lots of thinkers that were popular with Hitler and the Nazis and people like that. But it's worth saying that not every supporter of national identity has seen it in these ethnic or racial terms. For example, in England, there's this famous poem by Daniel Defoe, a true-born Englishman. And he mocks this whole idea that there's some pure racial basis to being English, pointing out we are really all foreigners ourselves, the result of centuries of migration, Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Normans. As he writes, fate jumbled them together, God knows how, whatever they were, they're true-born English now. And he's not against being English. He even highlights the English nation's wit, wealth, and courage. In other words, you don't need to believe that nations have some kind of pure ethnic ancestry to embrace a national identity. It's almost like there are different types of nationalism. Okay, so that's the first belief, and we can agree that's a myth, but then we get another.
Okay, so countries aren't correlated with ethnicity, but what about, language?
This is great. They look at this map of France showing all the different dialects and languages, explaining that only in this area did people speak anything like modern French. And I love the language as part of this video. It's wild to think that not too long ago, hardly anyone spoke the national language. There's a bit later on where they're talking about Italy, and they say that at the time of Italian unification, only 2.5% of Italians spoke Italian. I mean, that's crazy. Okay, so that's another belief. We can agree that one's a myth too. But again, not every country needs a common language to have a national identity. I mean, Canada has more than one. Wait, Switzerland.
Switzerland. I love Switzerland.
Johnny, you're obsessed with Switzerland. You're always making videos about Switzerland. And Switzerland is famous for having more than one language. It's got 3, 4, I can't remember how many exactly, but there's a lot of languages in Switzerland, and that doesn't mean that Swiss people don't have a national identity. And even if we accept that language is important for national identity, which I actually do think is true, that doesn't mean that countries aren't real. Okay, I think we need to pause here and talk about the terms or language in this video because it's confusing.
Okay, so Max has sufficiently convinced me that countries aren't real, that they're made up in our minds, and that France was not a real country until recently.
Okay, so first the word country. One way to understand country is sovereign state, member of the UN, has a foreign policy, that kind of thing. I actually think this is what most people think of when they think of the word country. And if that's what you mean by country, well then obviously countries have existed for ages, long before the 1800s, which is when Johnny Harris is saying that nationalism and national identity was invented. So I don't think he means that. I think he means a kind of new idea of a country, which is not just a state, but a state which has this nation inside it, right? A nation state. And obviously if nations are a new thing, then, well, countries have to be a new thing. But even if we're defining countries in those terms and we're saying countries are new, that doesn't mean they aren't real. I mean, obviously nation states, countries are real. They're everywhere.
Obsessed with the country of Switzerland and Swiss culture and everything Swiss.
I'm guessing this is just clickbait going wrong, right? He wanted a provocative title, and actually in the comments of the video, there's a list of all the different titles that Johnny Harris has used, and the one he's actually ended up, which is what it is right now, is How Humans Invented Nationalism. But still, this is a bit confusing because just because something is new or invented doesn't mean it's false or untrue. I mean, there's lots of concepts or ideologies. I mean, all of them, socialism, liberalism, democracy, they all have a start, but it's not this quality of having a beginning that makes them true or false or not. I think it's the myths part which is most important. I think the model is people's belief in nationalism is based on what they see as facts. But if we can see that it's based on myths, then it follows the whole thing is false. It's almost like a religion, right? Like Christianity is based on the belief that Jesus rose from the dead. And if that belief is false, then the rest of it crumbles. I think that's kind of the model that Harris has in his head when he's talking about nationalism. Okay, so we're going to focus on the myths part of it, which is good because now we've got another one.
For someone living down here, hundreds of kilometers from the King's Palace in Paris, there was no concept of being French. They'd probably identify with the people in their village or their town, but that is about it.
Okay, so not too long ago, no one, or at least no ordinary person, felt French or any kind of national identity. That's a new thing. So then Harris goes on to tell the story of how that national identity started and how it spread in France. It's a story about the French Revolution, Napoleon's wars, urbanization, mass media, railways, and there's a solid basis in history for this account. You've got famous thinkers like Ernest Gellner making this argument. He said, nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness, it invents nations where they do not exist. Benedict Anderson is another famous thinker on this subject. He famously called nations imagined communities. And the broad thrust of this story, I'm not going to disagree with. And this list of factors about how it spread in the 1800s, it's good. It's a good list. Now, I do have a few quibbles. It's not the main thing I'm here for, but I don't know. It's my video. So first,
there was no concept of being French.
Now, I'm not an academic historian, but the idea that no one but elites had any conception of national identity before the French Revolution, I mean, this really is overstatement. It's a bit difficult because commoners, peasants, didn't leave lots of records, and obviously the story varies between countries. But certainly in England, it's not hard to find evidence that long before 1800 and the French Revolution, ordinary people had some sense of English national identity. According to this medieval historian, as early as England's war with France in the 1300s, there was an English national identity emerging. Sermons in church, proclamations in the marketplace, all talk about the English nation. There were popular anti-French songs, chronicles, poems. Then in the late 1500s, you got Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare's always going on about England.
And upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George!
I mean, there's just lots of examples of this. As early as 900s, you've got coins that say King of the English. In the 1600s, the idea of freeborn Englishmen was a phrase used by the Levellers, a populist political movement. Actually, wait there a minute. Look, got it on detail. This isn't merch. I don't have any merch. Okay, so there's a historical debate about when this started, but everyone agrees that it started off weak and it grew over time. Next.
Countries are a new thing, but here's the deal. Our leaders don't want us to know that. In France, the ruling elite at the time didn't want to admit that France was kind of a new thing. That would sound way too weak and delicate. So they kind of constructed a national mythology that implied that France has kind of been around forever.
So here we have the idea that nationalism was all created by elites indoctrinating the masses. And again, this is overstatement. If your story about nationalism is just about elites, then you're missing how much humans desire a group identity. I mean, this point was even made by the guy who really started the whole idea of nationalism being an invention, arguing nationalism took off partly because as people moved to the cities, they needed a new form of connection. And more generally, if you've watched my channel, you'll know that I find these kinds of explanations unconvincing. There's an instinct to think that any idea that you find uncompelling, conservatism, anti-immigration, voting for Trump must be the result of elites manipulating the masses, which is just a bad model of human psychology. I mean, think about it. If it was so easy for elites to manipulate nationalist feeling, the British wouldn't have had so many problems in Ireland, India, and many other places in their empire.
Irish freedom!
And finally, in the use of the word fake or made up in our minds is this idea that there's no substance to this national myth at all. Like, there's no real things to base it on. And I think that's wrong. I mean, there were a people called the English. It's there on the coins, poems, plays that we've been looking at. There was a common language from at least the 1300s. And there is a regular presence on a geographical area. There's nothing going on here. Nationalism is the project of taking those real things and weaving them into something stronger. There's selection, exaggeration, but to say it's fake, I think, is misleading. There's actually a bit of a fashion at the moment for people describing concepts that they want to pick apart as myths, and I think it's confusing for people. One way to explain what's going on is to think of units of time. So hours, minutes, seconds, these are basically arbitrary. They're made up in our minds. Whereas years or days are based on something real, something natural. It's the spinning of the earth and the earth going around the sun. Like, it doesn't matter where the culture is in the world, they're probably going to come up with these concepts of day and year. So you've got arbitrary invention and natural concept. Okay, but now think of the month, right? The month is somewhat arbitrary, right? Some months are slightly shorter, longer. It's sort of all made up. But they are based on something real, the lunar cycle. So months are kind of a mix. And I think Harris is saying that nations are completely arbitrary, just made up of nothing. And on the other hand, you have these kind of primordialists, people that believe that nations have been there from time immemorial, that there's nothing invented or constructed about them at all. And yeah, I think there's something of a mix. Okay, so there's the quibbles. I think at this point it'd be good to sum up where we got to. Okay, nationalism, each state has a nation, it's new, it's based on these myths, nations have a genetic basis, nations have always had a common language, and nations have always existed. Whereas we can agree, with a few quibbles, that they developed over time. Okay, so at this point, we kind of switch gear.
Crazy about this is once you start to really get your head around the national myth, you kind of see it everywhere. And you start to see how much it has influenced our modern history. Identities that have led to war and conflict all over the world. So let's go back to Europe really quick and look at a few more, like Germany.
We've got to Germany. We know what's coming up. Okay, Harris goes on to tell the story about how in the 1800s, nationalism helped unite Germany, also united Italy, and then after the First World War, it was really influential in shaping the new map of Europe.
The winners got together and redrew the entire map around the national idea. One nation for one people. The idea is that this would kind of create peace, because if one people were just in these boundaries, then there'd be no need to fight wars. Right? Wrong.
This is an important point. Nationalism, as it's usually understood, is more than just a sense of national identity. It's actually a political project. And this idea of one nation for one people, it shaped the borders of many of the countries you see today. Harris is right that this idea of nationalism, that every nation should have its own state, it can cause conflict. I mean, he could have also talked about the problem of endless minorities. For example, in Ireland, you had a region where everyone was mostly Catholic, but you had a minority of Protestants in Ulster in the northeast. And the Protestants, because they were a minority, feared being in an independent island. So the British decided to make a new border, create Northern Ireland to let Protestants be the majority in their own country. Both sides get national self-determination. Great. But now you've got a new minority. Catholics, who used to be the majority, are now a new minority inside the bigger country. And then what do? Do they get a new country inside Northern Ireland? And what do you do about the Protestants inside that new country? So yeah, nationalism can lead to war and conflict. But here's where things really hot up.
Wrong. Because borders were never going to be perfectly drawn around a people. Like, this is Germany's border, but this is where all the German speakers are. You can see they don't line up. So instead, all of this redrawing of borders led to ultra-nationalists rising up across Europe on promises to conquer the land that they considered rightfully theirs, which led to yet another world war. And this gets to the dark side of the idea of a nation. It very naturally breeds the persecution of minorities. Because if a nation is supposedly defined by its shared ethnic identity, then anyone who is not in that majority identity is an outsider. They're a threat to the character of the nation. Now, of course, the national identity, the national character, the ethnic identity, all of this was made up, but boy did people start to believe that it was real. Fascists would go on to murder millions in the name of nationalism.
We've got to the Nazis. Okay, we're at my biggest problems with this video. Now, we've already had confusion about countries, are they not real? But at this point, there's just so many things mashed together. First, there's what we might call thick and thin versions of nationalism. At some points, Harris talks about nationalism as just national identity.
You're American, or Brazilian, or Japanese, or Mexican, or Egyptian, Nigerian, Dutch, Micronesian.
At other times, it's a full-blown ideology. It's got myths, it's got a political project, and it leads to genocide.
Would go on to murder millions in the name of nationalism.
And the question is it just an identity, or is it more than that? Now, as someone who feels a sense of nationality, part of a community united by heritage and identity, I feel like I can just take the thin version and leave the thick, nasty version to someone else. To me, it doesn't matter if this identity doesn't have a genetic basis, doesn't have a common language, or hasn't always existed. The whole model that Johnny Harris is working off just doesn't seem relevant. Making this distinction, I think, also might help explain the historical debate, as there's clearly some sense of national identity long before modernism and the French Revolution, but the full-blown ideology, that certainly seems like something much more recent. Another distinction that might help here is between the sort of dark ethnocultural nationalism that Harris describes and that leads to genocide and so on, and what is often called civic nationalism. Ethnocultural nationalism, that's the one that's closed, based on genetic identity, views itself as superior to other nations, hostile to diversity, and wishes to exclude minorities and anyone else who doesn't fit. Whereas civic nationalism is open, based on citizenship. It obviously likes its own country and sees it as unique, but doesn't see it as superior to other countries, but equal. It's open to diversity, and it's inclusive to anyone in the state who wants to join. I, like many in the UK, have at least two national identities in the sense that I'm English and British. And definitely Britishness has traditionally always been built around multiple peoples and languages. Another word here is patriotism, what George Orwell described as devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world and has no wish to force on other people. Which, sums up a lot of my feelings. Okay, so once Harris has argued that nationalism is based on myths and leads to war and genocide, he and his guests start to consider what kind of alternatives there might be.
How would you describe a cosmopolitan identity?
Think of people who live in a big global city like New York or Hong Kong or London or Singapore, and this identity that you are a person of the world, that you're a globe traveler, that you're taking in many different cultures. That's kind of cosmopolitan identity.
The origin of this word is citizen of the world, and it's how many, including Mariah Carey, identify. Personally, I'm drawn to this. I like the idea of being in a worldwide community, but this doesn't negate my other identities, right? Like I still feel affection for being British and English. Also, once you start thinking of it as a political system rather than just an identity, it's not quite so simple. Cosmopolitanism implies a world government, right? Dissolving national borders, some big world system. And as a liberal who's worried about power all in one place, that's kind of worrying. I feel like we'd want power divided and closer to the voters. So I expect we'd want to break up the big system into smaller political units, a kind of federalism, a kind of country system. I mean, doesn't it sound quite similar to what we've got now? Especially when you start to consider that people in these little political units would start forming group identities and sense of attachment, especially if there was some kind of conflict with the one next door. I just feel like we'd be back where we started.
What else do you think exists out there that could replace this? And does the nation ever go away? Or does it just get watered down and become less salient over time?
There are lots of places that you can get your sense of identity and your sense of community from. I mean, I think there are people who find that in religion. You can find that in your...
Wait. Religion? You think religion would be a more peaceful form of identity? I don't think religion is necessarily a more peaceful form of identity. I'm guessing you've heard of the wars of religion, the Crusades, conflict between Protestants and Catholics.
And may the Christian Lord guide my hand against your Roman popery. Prepare to receive the true Lord.
Look, this is the big problem with this video. Harris talks about finding a more enlightened form of identity because he thinks that nationalism necessarily leads to war and conflict and genocide, and it's based on myths and it's fake and it was all made up in the 1800s. And if we could just switch to something better, then we wouldn't have these problems. But any form of identity you pick, people will form in-groups and out-groups. That's just a psychological fact of life. And you end up with all the same potential problems. More generally, this whole argument, which is ultimately about nationalism leading to war and attacks on minorities, fits into a tradition of the left being distrustful of nationalism. I should say at this point, I'm moving away from this particular video. Like, I don't know what Johnny Harris's political views are. But I wonder if this video is inspired by what's going on with Trump and anti-immigration and the rise of the far right, and a real recognition of how nationalism can go toxic and become this nasty, divisive force in life. The other critique from the left is that instead of national identity, the workers should focus on the class struggle and economics and resist being divided. As Marx and Engels say in the Communist Manifesto, the worker has no country. The argument is that national identity, and in fact all issues of identity, are distractions from workers' real interests. If we could just get everyone to realise that this whole nationalism thing is a trick, then they can focus on the revolution. But there's issues with this whole argument. First, ordinary people do care about national identity. Just saying it's made up in your mind won't change that. Too often the left, or at least in the UK, has given the impression that it's not really comfortable with national identity. And actually a small part of Labour's recent win was a decision to be more patriotic. But I don't think the left has to just put up with national identity, because that's what the voters want. Actually, there's the left-wing case to support it. First, the left should remember that national identity was a key force in decolonisation, the end of empires, all sorts of things that the left usually support. It's also inspired anti-racist movements, black nationalism for example. It's also important to groups of people like the Ukrainians and Palestinians that the left is usually on the side of. I mean, Palestinians are always being told they're not a nation. And in the Ukraine war, the person who's making the not a real country argument, is Vladimir Putin. For me, national identity doesn't have to be toxic. There are, as we've seen, nice, open, civic versions available. And not everyone has to feel like this, but I don't think there's anything illegitimate about loving the place you've grown up in. Its customs, histories, people, accents, ways of doing things, its personalities, its quirks. I just think it's natural. And as all those historians identified, modern life is atomized and individual and lacking connection. And in that context, it's nice to have something which gives you a source of solidarity or unity. So, because nationality doesn't require a genetic basis, because it's not essential to have a common language, and it doesn't matter if it developed in the 1800s, because national identity doesn't necessarily lead to conflict, and any alternative has the same potential to turn toxic, because this idea has a history of supporting those on the left as much as any other political tradition, and because it's a common, legitimate identity shared by many ordinary people, I respectfully disagree with Johnny Harris. Johnny Harris actually had some backlash to another video he made recently, which appeared to blame NATO expansion for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In response to this backlash, he ended up taking the video down. However, this argument about NATO expansion and how it really being the West's fault is definitely still around, and I actually made a response to that argument last year in this video. The video also explains realism, which is one of those influential ideas behind the news which I love to explain. So if you enjoyed this video, I recommend you check that one out next.